Okay, folks, let's get started here. Today we're going to talk about the good news is that there is bad news, and the reason for that is that as I see these things unfold that indicate to me and to a lot of others that we're living in the end times, the bad news can get a bit overwhelming at times. But that's good news because Jesus told us and the prophets told us that when these things were happening, that we should look up because we have hope. And we know how the story ends, and it can be very distressing to go through it at those times. But as these things converge, as things get closer and closer together, as the world seems to be falling apart, there really is hope. And I will acknowledge, though, a lot of times it's bad news. It's distressing. We know from 2 Peter chapter 2 that Lot, when Lot saw all the things that were going on in Sodom and Gomorrah around here, 2 Peter chapter 2 tells us that he was distressed by the horrible behavior that he saw going on around him. Now, if you see what's going on in the world and it doesn't bother you or you don't think it's bad, then you really should be concerned about yourself because it really is that bad. It seems as everything has come unglued. For example, this week, I don't have anything on all the earthquakes that are happening in the Ring of Fire. They're happening, as best as I can tell, based on the articles and research that I've been able to do, they're happening at a rate that has never been seen before. It seems in many areas we have these disasters that happen. We have a volcano and then a hurricane or floods. We have forest fires, then floods. They had fires in Greece, then floods. It seems like there are these these two things that are happening that ought to be really getting people's attention, that maybe somebody's trying to send you a message. You know, in the Bible it says, out of the mouth of what? 2 or 3 witnesses, let everything be established. And so when you see these disasters happening all around the world in twos, maybe that's an indication that there are a couple of witnesses that this is an unusual time in human history. So I'm not dogmatic on that, but it's a point a friend of mine made, and I think it's worthy of consideration. When Jesus came the first time, he was fulfilling all of these messianic prophecies, a lot of messianic prophecies about his first coming. People didn't accept it. Even religious people who had been studying the scriptures didn't accept it. And it may have been, and I may intersperse this a little bit through my talk today, that they just had their preconceived notions as to how everything was going to work out based on the prophetic scriptures. And then when the actual fulfillment of those scriptures was sitting right in front of them, standing right in front of them, teaching, they didn't recognize it. Jesus eventually started talking in parables, and his disciples came to him. This is Matthew 13, and I think there's some application and wisdom that we can take from this passage to the situation that we live in today. And the disciples came and said unto him, Why speakest thou unto them in parables? He answered and said unto them, Because it is given unto you to know the mysteries of the kingdom of heaven, but to them it is not given. For whomsoever hath, to him shall be given, and he shall have more abundance. But whosoever hath not, from him shall be taken away, even that he hath. Therefore I speak to them in parables, because they seeing see not, and hearing they hear not, neither do they understand. And in them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah, which saith, By hearing ye shall hear, and shall not understand, and seeing ye shall see, and shall not perceive. And that's an interesting point that Jesus made there is, I don't know that a lot of people were running around saying, hey, when the Messiah comes, he's going to speak about things and we're not going to understand him. He's going to speak to us in parables. But Jesus himself says, look, and he does this continually. You see it through Matthew and the other Gospels. He says, look, this is the fulfillment of this prophecy. Like a virgin shall conceive. I don't know that there were a lot of people running around saying, okay, we're waiting for a virgin to conceive and have a baby. But there was a prophecy about it, and Scripture clearly tells us that was a prophecy about the first coming of Messiah. So we have to be careful we don't get too dogmatic in our opinions about how things are going to work out, that we actually miss the way it's going to work out. Verse 15, for this people's heart is waxed gross, and their ears are dull of hearing, and their eyes have closed, lest at any time they should see with their eyes and hear with their ears, and should understand with their heart and should be converted, and I should heal them. And then he gives a verse, a statement that I think is very comforting to Christians living in troubled times. I know that a lot of us say, I don't think I ever would see that before the Lord came back. We see this all the time now. And Jesus, when the disciple talking about this, he goes, listen, but blessed are your eyes, for they see, and your ears, for they hear. For verily I say unto you, that many prophets and righteous men have desired to see those things which ye see, and have not seen them, and to hear those things which ye hear, and have not heard them. So when you see all these things happening that are bad news, that's good news. That for generations, people have wanted to live in the time of the Lord's return. And when we live in a time which certainly appears to be nearing the time of the Lord's return, we should consider ourselves blessed that we're alive to see it. And that we're alive to act on what we see. Now, the reaction of people will be somewhat similar to Jesus. They may not understand. But our obligation is to give them the message and the gospel. And I think God is pretty capable of taking care of the rest. Do as good a job as you can, but God can use our meager offerings. I got a call from a lady once. She said, I watched your prophecy update last Sunday and I got saved. And I'm like, to be honest with you, I don't even remember sharing the gospel. But God used it in His way. Praise the Lord. It happens. So here's somebody said, would you please do this? Jack Phillips of Master Peak Cake Shop in Lakewood, Colorado, is, as you know, being, I don't think there's any other way to say it, persecuted by these string of charges that keep being brought against him by the Colorado Human Rights Commission. So there's a couple ways to react to that. Pray that this stops. Pray that people see the light. Pray that the people that are doing this, I think wrongfully, get removed. And if you want to support his cake shop, there's an email address. You can ask for a cookie brownie menu. And I'm not even going to suggest what, if you do order from him, what you do with those. You know, you can do whatever you want. You could send them to someone, but that's no, don't tempt me. And just so you know, praise the Lord, we'll be in 2 weeks from this Sunday. We'll be in our new building. So one more Sunday here, and then we'll start over there in Sunbury. Now, I've made a lot of jokes about Sunbury over the years. And I think that God has a sense of humor. So be careful who you make fun of, and or what you make fun of, because God you may end up there. So that'll be Sunbury, Ohio in a couple weeks. I don't want to talk too much. People ask me, since I'm a lawyer, and as you may have noticed, there's some legal things going on in the news with the president and others around him. And what does it mean, and what are they doing, and why are they doing this? And the answer is, it's complicated. I don't think you could make there, by any stretch of the imagination, could you make a case that Robert Mueller, as I've heard some people try to say, is actually secretly working for President Trump. I don't see that. I don't understand why you would say that. Kimberly Strassel has a great article, column in the Wall Street Journal on Thursday, this past Thursday or Friday, when justice is partial. Now, one thing that happened this week was the head of the publisher of the National Enquirer got immunity, and Trump's finance chief, the CFO of the Trump companies, got a limited immunity to cooperate with prosecutors. Now, why do they do that? Because you have a Fifth Amendment right. You're not obligated to testify against yourself. You can take the Fifth Amendment. You're not obligated to give an FBI interview. You're not, you may have to appear before a grand jury and give testimony, but you can take the Fifth Amendment if you think that your testimony could incriminate you, cause you to be subject to criminal prosecution. The way prosecutors get around this is they do it a couple of ways. One is if they're going for a big fish, trying to land the big fish, they will give immunity to people around him to get them to testify and give statements. So I just would ask you, who do you think they're going after? They've given the CFO of the Trump companies immunity. They have given a publisher friend of the president's immunity. Just add up, who do you think they're going after? And I think it becomes pretty clear who they're going after. The other way they get testimony is they will put pressure on someone to get them to sing. That happened with the case of Michael Cohen, one of the president's attorneys, private attorneys. They put pressure on him. They got his financial records. They got other records of his, and they combed through those and found that he had done something wrong. So they brought charges against him, but it's my understanding that not only did they bring charges against Michael Cohen, they were threatening charges against his wife and other people. And that's how they do it, to get people to sing. Although Alan Dershowitz, I think, who is by no means a supporter of the president or a conservative by any stretch of the imagination, but he is a good thinker. He's a classic liberal, not a leftist, he's a liberal. And he said that really so much they get people, they're not singing but composing. They're putting together facts. So I saw a report this morning, they're going to charge President Trump with lying to the FBI. And this is common. This is Martha Stewart. They were trying to bring charges against her for insider trading, but they never brought insider trading charges against her because she never committed insider trading. But she said something in her FBI interview that was contradicted by another person, and they charged her with lying. And it only has to be contradicted by one person. And so the question then becomes who, and listen, I've done cases, I know how the system works. I know how an indictment happens. I know the pressure that is brought to bear on people by prosecutors with the threats. They did the same thing to Tommy Robinson when he had a conviction years ago for, I think, mortgage fraud or bank fraud. They were threatening his wife with prosecution. And so he pled guilty because he didn't want his wife to have the burden of going through that. This happens listen, the system is, in some respects, look, if I did this as a private attorney against someone, I would be in trouble. But prosecutors are allowed to do it because it's, quote, the way the system works. So just understand that. And Kimberly Strassel makes a good thing is, why is justice not partial? The Steele dossier, I think it's pretty well established now that the Steele dossier came from Steele's contacts with Russian intelligence, and it was paid for by the Clinton campaign. So who was colluding with Russia? And I think conservative people, they just want the system to be fair. And it does not have the appearance of fairness in this particular situation. So you might, here's what, just listen to the opening paragraph of Kimberly's column the other day. U.S. Attorney Robert Khuzami took a few moments in his Tuesday statement about Michael Cohen's plea deal to sing neutrality's praise. This is the U.S. attorney who's prosecuting Michael Cohen and getting him to sing, or as Professor Dershowitz said, maybe compose what he's going to say. His day of reckoning serves as a reminder that we are a nation of laws with one set of rules that applies equally to everyone. Noble words, and they used to mean something, but a disparity of justice is at the heart of our current crisis of faith in institutions. Americans aren't outraged that the Federal Bureau of Investigation felt obliged to investigate allegations leveled at campaigns, or that a special counsel is looking at Russian electoral interference. They are instead furious that Lady Justice seems to have it in for only one side. The country has watched the FBI treat one presidential campaign with kid gloves, the other with informants, warrants, and eavesdropping. They've seen the Justice Department resist all efforts at accountability, even as it fails to hold its own accountable. And don't get me started on the one-sided media. And so you might look that up. It's a great article. Now, this is the editorial page of the editorial section, the review section of today's New York Times. Now, New York Times is a left-wing newspaper. They do, if you learn how to read it, you can gather the truth from it. It's sort of like you can read Russia news agencies. Even back at the height of the Soviet Union, analysts would read Russian newspapers and the press, TASS, Sputnik, those type of organizations, Pravda, and to gather what was going on in Russia. And there was an art to reading it because you had to weed through the propaganda. That's what you have to do with the New York Times. Usually it's in the last 3 or 4 paragraphs because they figure people that support them will have stopped reading by then, and people that don't support their view will have stopped reading by then too. So they throw the facts in at the end. But there's an interesting editorial in today's, 2 editorials in today's New York Times. The first is on the front page, The New Socialists, talking about these people as they don't really, it says, the argument against capitalism isn't that it makes us poor, is that it makes us unfree. Now, you don't, let me read it again. The argument against capitalism isn't that it makes us poor, it's that it makes us unfree. Okay, so this is Romans 1 moment this morning. It doesn't make any sense, right? How free does it look like they are in, say, Venezuela? I saw a great picture today of like the piles of cash that you have to buy a loaf of bread, a gallon of milk, and that type of thing. And people are fleeing. 4 million Venezuelans have fled the country over the past months. They fled to neighboring countries, Colombia, Brazil, and guess what? Those people don't want them because they don't share our values. They're crazy socialists. They want to take everything. And so then there's another article about student debt. It's worse than we imagine, and the article advocates we have to do something about student debt. We have to put the brakes on it, and we have to make college affordable again. And so you'll have this young congressional candidate running around, wow, it's been so awesome. We're going to have free college. There's no free college. There's no free health care. What's the old saying? Socialism is great until you run out of other people's money. And so the guy goes, oh, look, we just have to make college more affordable and we could get a handle on student debt. Why do we have so much student debt? Because the federal government made it so easily available. And what happened when there became a lot more money available? Go down and look at the billions. Am I exaggerating that there have been billions of dollars of buildings constructed down in Ohio State in the last 15 years? It's shocking. It's in the billions. And they did that because there's all this federal money available, but then the problem is you got to pay it back. And I see young attorneys that I've seen come into law firms, and they're making a good wage, but they have $250,000 in student debt. How do you get away from that? And part of it is the availability of money. So it's sort of like this one just doesn't make any sense, and then this one is like, look what happened. Examine the evidence and the facts. Now, I talk a lot about this transgender confusion thing, and Heather McDonald in the City Journal, one of the great writers, and it seems like they are, the writers that I read are these solid, good-thinking female writers: Melanie Phillips, Caroline Glick, Heather McDonald, Kimberly Strassel. And so those are four of the ones that I follow and read most of everything that they put out. And so Heather McDonald has this article. She saw something in the Yale Alumni Magazine, and her title of the article is "Gender is a Construct Except When It's Not." For academic feminists, male and female biology is either interchangeable or immutable depending on what complaint they need to lodge. So she goes through this. Here's her opening paragraph. A foundational tenet of academic feminism holds that alleged differences between males and females are socially constructed. This credo usually maximizes the opportunities for charging sexism, yet it will be discarded in an instant if acknowledging the innate biological and psychological differences between men and women yields an additional trove of feminist complaint. The current issue of Yale Alumni Magazine shows how the game is played. And this article is, "We wouldn't have known it if we hadn't looked. A fund at Yale is jumpstarting new research on gender and health." And they talk about, we need to look at these things because what they're finding is that they used to exclude women from studies because they would have babies and they would have hormones when they would have babies, and therefore we probably shouldn't study them. So we'll study 40-year-old white men, even though medication will act differently with women as a general rule in some cases than it will with men. It's just a fact. Jesus, when he was approached about marriage and divorce, one of the things he said, God created them male and female. So I'm going to trust Jesus that he knew what happened in the beginning. Just like they argue about young earth creation versus old earth creation. When you go to Exodus, it says that the Ten Commandments were written by the finger of God on stone. So I figure if God takes the time to write something on stone, probably important to look at, and it says here he made things in what? 6 days. And on the seventh day he rested. So then he said, so you people here running around the desert, eventually you're going to spend 40 years out here, but do you think that when he said, you should work 6 days and rest on the seventh, that they would have understood days any other way than a day? And so when he said, I created the world in 6 days and rested on the seventh, now we have to interpret that differently. It just doesn't make any sense. So we see this, God's made them male and female, and now what is one of the big things that's happening in universities and institutions all over the place is people are messing with that. A teacher in California sent me a link to videos that she now has to watch to prepare her for what she thinks is coming next year about how they're going to have to teach gender and sex to her. I think she's a first or second grade teacher. It's coming. So, by the way, do anything you can, especially in California, get your kids out of public school. You need to do it. So anyway, Heather goes on. So she says, in any case, it's mysterious why this alleged neglect of females in medical research should matter. If sex differences are socially constructed, if males and females are the same psychologically and physically, before the patriarchy starts assigning sex roles, then medical research need not distinguish between males and females either. It turns out, however, that males and females differently respond to stress, environmental risk factors, drugs, and disease, as an initiative called Women's Health Research at Yale devotes itself to documenting. And they find things like 2/3 of Alzheimer's patients are female, 75% of people with autoimmune disorders are female, females are less likely to develop Parkinson's disease, adult females have twice the rate of depression as adult males. And I thought I would add a couple of my research findings. Men and women react differently to the Hallmark Channel. Okay. And they react differently to Hallmark Shop. I think I don't know if I said this here, but I went, it was Pam's birthday, so on my way home, I stopped to get a card. And I went immediately back to the birthday section. I know where it is. And I came up, and the lady at the counter at the Hallmark Shop checked me out. She goes, what? She kind of looks at me, kind of last minute, aren't you? Did you forget? I said, no, I didn't forget. I've been planning for a whole year to buy her a card at the last minute. The difference between male and female, right? Okay, so we know this, we know are these charges. So she goes on, and there's all these things, and Male says, like, well, gee, what? And so the people at Yale are like, so male and females are different. But the social sciences over here are saying that it's just all a social construct. But she says, yet feminist social justice warriors are perfectly capable of proceeding on several contradictory fronts simultaneously. And so down here it says, an assistant professor at the medical school suggests asking students how the prognosis of a disease changes if the patient identifies as a man or a woman. And she goes on to note that we have 100 different gender classifications now. And so what, if somebody's identifying as one of those, are you going to make all these different changes? Medicine becomes impossible to practice. It's hard for me to finish the sentences because I'm trying to explain what, I'm trying to actually articulate what is really just sort of Romans 1 unreasoning, not lack of reasoning. Expect to see millions of taxpayer-derived research dollars, Heather concludes, directed towards the first reading that someone's self-declared gender identity should be taken into account in diagnosing disease, even as the evidence piles up that males and females are not a political construction but a biological one. Given that we are now up to over 100 different gender identities, the diagnostic complications will be enormous. Nevertheless, the march of academic identity politics through the institutions continues. Yeah. Well, that's Heather's conclusion, and she's pretty intelligent. So let's look at a few other okay. So let's get into some geopolitics. This is an interesting article. This is in Foreign Policy. It was picked up by a blog called The War Zone about China's very dangerous to freedom. They're loaning all kinds of money to people. They're building projects in countries, and they're making those countries essentially subservient to them in terms of debt. They're now, as the U.S. and Turkey's relations get fractured, China's moving into Turkey to shore up Turkey with money and that sort of thing. And Erdogan has, I mentioned, Erdogan has all these massive projects, building what will be the largest airport in the world outside of Istanbul on the European side of the Bosporus. And here's what China did, though, back during and I believe this was during the Obama administration. Foreign Policy's reported on it now, reports come out. Botched CIA communication system helped blow cover of Chinese agents. They were using an old system that wasn't secure. China figured it out, and they figured out who were all the agents the United States was using to gather intelligence in China. And so China fired them, right? Or China executed them by the dozens. We don't even have a concept on how, and so it's making us fly a bit blind on Chinese intelligence. And then we have China hacking into our, there was a contractor that they hacked into that had top secret information, even though it wasn't really classified as top secret, but the information was. And China's coming up with these hypersonic missiles, and we don't really have a good defense to them. These missiles that can go 8 times the speed of sound, and there's no missile defense to them that we have right now. And we don't even have comparable technology. And what it does, at least for a time until we figure out how to deal with it, if we can, is it makes our aircraft carriers sitting ducks. And a lot of the technology that they got, or the concepts they got from hacking into our material. This sad story of Molly Tibbetts, who was murdered out in Iowa. She went jogging and she was murdered. And I just say it is undocumented immigrant. I took a screenshot from CNN. And then they asked Senator Elizabeth Warren, AKA Pocahontas, what she thought of the whole situation. I want you to listen. I want you to listen to how this person thinks. And remember it if she ever runs for office that you have a chance to vote for.
I want to get one last question in here because it is a story, a very important story in the news. It has to do with Molly Tibbetts, the young woman in Iowa who was murdered, her body believed to be found yesterday. A person has been charged with it. This person is an undocumented immigrant. Mike Pence and the president have suggested the immigration laws need to be stronger so that people like this man who was accused of this murder were not in the country. Your reaction?
You know, I'm so sorry for the family here, and I know this is hard, not only for the family, but for the people in her community, the people throughout Iowa. But one of the things we have to remember is we need an immigration system that is effective, that focuses on where real problems are. Last month, I went down to the border, and I saw where children had been taken away from their mothers. I met with those mothers who had been lied to, who didn't know where their children were, who hadn't had a chance to talk to their children, and there was no plan for how they would be reunified with their children. I think we need immigration laws that focus on people who pose a real threat, and I don't think mamas and babies are the place that we should be spending our resources. Separating a mama from a baby does not make this country safer.
Did anybody get the blink rate on her eyes there towards the end? That's another. How do you even, Liz, she was murdered, Liz. Why didn't she just say, I'm sorry, boy, that's just terrible, and we should try to make sure this never happens again? She could have just stopped there, but she had to make some point about President Trump and his policies. It's, you know what, it's sick the way she thinks. It's sick. And she wants to run, I'm here, she may run for president. Front Page Magazine has a great article by Bryce Bauer, B-A-W-E-R. Then Islamic, he was talking about going to a conference in 2007. And he spoke at this conference in 2007. It was about immigration and the time, this was 11 years ago, beginning of Muslim immigration into Europe. And so he got up and he listened to these people talk. And then he got to speak at the lunch hour. They flew him first class all the way from Europe because he had written a book called While Europe Slept. How Radical Islam is Destroying the West from Within. He wrote this back in 2007. There are other people who wrote books about that too. Bauer from France, can't remember the name of her great book, Bat, and it's Y/EOR. Great book. Melanie Phillips, Londonistan, talking about this. Melanie's book came out about 2006, around the same time. And he said, just listen to what he said. He's writing about what happened to him in 2007 at this lunch, or this seminar. My first doubts in this respect began to rise only moments after the event kicked off. Sitting through the morning's panels, I heard one highly credentialed individual after another, professors, politicians, and retired and active diplomats from various countries join in predicting a glowing future for Western Europe. Socially and economically, they all agreed prospects looked a lot brighter for Western Europe than for America. Not a single one of the dozen or so panelists diverged from this consensus. After 4 hours of sunny prophesizing, everybody lined up for the buffet. When they were all back in their seats, I was introduced from a lectern up front, and from a lectern up front proceeded to serve up a condensed version of the argument of my 2006 book, While Europe Slept. I described the rise of Islam in Western Europe and the failure of Muslims to integrate and the consequent increase in gang crime, welfare dependency, forced marriage, Sharia-run enclaves, and numerous other ills, the usual litany. Western Europe, I maintain, was undergoing a radical metamorphosis that, unless drastic action were taken, would ultimately bring its liberal democracies crashing down. One more example, in March 2007, Newsweek ran a special report on Europe at 50. That piece, too, cited a handful of recent books about the rise of Islam in Europe, my own included. Like the Financial Times reviewer, the Newsweek writer was thoroughly dismissive. Citing our worries about Western Europe's Islamization, he wrote, "To most who live in Europe or have visited lately, all this seems wrong, even absurd. Far from being in peril of Muslim domination, he asserted Europe was moving from strength to strength. 50 years after the EU's march to unity began, it is now Europe, not the United States, that's held as a new lamp to the nations, held up as a new lamp to the nations." He then goes on in that article to cite a recent editorial that was in the German paper called Name I Can't Say, without embarrassing myself. Essentially what the lady in this article says was, yes, this is happening, but it's not that bad. Now, it's interesting, since that article was written, I could show you video of 5 or 6 cities in Sweden where cars were torched overnight in one night within the last week and a half. All starting at 9 p.m. at night. And now nothing happens. Everybody's taking pictures of everything that's happening. I would recommend, I don't have time to get into it in detail, that there's a great article at Gatestone Institute I think you should all read. Macron's Partition of France. Now, everybody holds up Macron. He's this great person. France is great because France, in their constitution, or they have a 1905 law that requires their government to be secular. Not really supposed to have religious involvement in it. So France will hold the line. And this article goes through in excruciating detail with great lengths. It is well-researched, well-written, and the conclusion is Macron is surrendering to the immigrants. The first legislative writer abolished the obligation that talks about some recent things happened in France. The first legislative writer abolished the obligation of religious associations to declare themselves as lobbying groups, a measure that clearly opens the way for entities such as the Muslim Brotherhood to lobby members of parliament without leaving a trace. Next point, it is, however, the business of the secular state of France to organize Muslims and train Republican imams, ? And this is exactly what Macron's government is doing. In fact, in these largely immigrant enclaves around Paris and others, it's shocking. It's absolutely shocking what's going on. And everybody acts like, oh, Europe's this great place. To be honest with you, it's troubling. And we see terror attack after terror attack, and everybody acts like nothing's going on. So listen, what's the lesson to grab from an article like this? One is, when this final beast empire and that sort of thing comes together, some think it's Europe, some think it's Middle East, everybody has their own opinion. And everybody acts like, oh, well, that could never happen here, or that could never happen there, or Islam could never be important in the governance of Europe. And I'm just saying is, I would not be too dismissive of that. Because it's happening everywhere you look. And France is now setting up, essentially governing authority to Muslim immigrants in their communities. The article is shocking. The big question is, the article says, who will be heading and managing this new framework? Will it be the Muslim Brotherhood, the most powerful organization which controls more than 2,000 mosques in France, or a young guard of Muslim technocrats close to the president, but with no ties to mosque, imams, and the organized Muslim community in general? And the conclusion is a big problem. Another thing that you're seeing rising in the world, so read that article at Gatestone Institute, title, Macron's Partition of France. It's a fascinating read. And then try to, so if you're a person who believes that the final beast empire comes from a revived Roman Empire situated in Europe, read what you think will happen in light of what's actually going on. And I only say this because, again, these prophecies don't always work out exactly the way that we think they will. And things change. You may not have noticed this. Things change pretty quickly these days. So just be open to that. Another problem is anti-Semitism, and this is an event coming up, Students for Justice in Palestine, SJP, conference at UCLA in November. We have a Christ at the Checkpoint conference coming up in Oklahoma City in the middle of October. I believe I've heard that Stephen Sizer will be speaking. And of course, they'll have like one speaker that they say, well, this proves that we're open to other ideas. Don't believe that. This continues to be a problem with the Labour Party in Great Britain. Jeremy Corbyn and the party, they won't really adopt the International Holocaust Remembrance Association's definition of anti-Semitism. They really can't do it. It's tearing apart the Labour Party. Part of it was because this video from 2013 surfaced. Here's Jeremy Corbyn talking about it. And we showed you last week pictures of him laying a wreath with people at a ceremony to honor people that were part of Black September. The people that mutilated, then murdered the Israeli athletes at the 1972 Munich Olympics. And of course, Jeremy has to stand in solidarity with him. And here's what he had to say at a conference in 2013.
The other evening we had a meeting in Parliament in which Manuel made an incredibly powerful and passionate and effective speech about the history of Palestine, the rights of the Palestinian people. This was dutifully recorded by the thankfully silent Zionists who were in the audience on that occasion, and then came up and berated him afterwards for what he had said. They clearly have two problems. One is they don't want to study history, and secondly, having lived in this country for a very long time, probably all their lives, they don't understand English irony either. Manuel does understand English irony and uses it very, very effectively, so I think they needed two lessons which we can perhaps help them with.
Okay, so listen, the takeaway from that is, well, don't take my word for it. Take the word of Luciana Berger, who is Jewish, British Jew, and she saw this video. She's a Labour Party member. She said the video released today of the leader of the UK Labour Party making inexcusable comments defended by party spokesman Jeremy Corbyn, just name him the next time, makes me, as a proud British Jew, feel unwelcome in my own party. I've lived in Britain all my life and I don't need lessons in history/irony. Interesting thing. So watch that. This rise of anti-Semitism, anti-Jewishness, anti-Israel, they're all tied together. People say, oh, I'm anti-Israel, but I'm not anti-Jewish. Listen, folks, stay for the end of my talk today and tell me that anti-Israel is not anti-Jewish. I want you to see this. Syria. Look at some of the statistics about what's going on in Syria. This is 7.5 years into the Syrian civil war. There's a website, I can't remember the name of it right off the top of my head. It's a wiki type site. Talks about all the different strength, all the different people who have people there. But here is the statistics of the Syrian civil war taken, and they have footnotes and sources and that type of thing, of people killed in the Syrian civil war from the Syrian government army, armed forces. Between 63,000 and 100,000 soldiers have been killed. There have been 4,700 soldiers and militiamen and 2,000 supporters captured, put in prison. Don't tell me that Assad is a good guy. I know he's defending his country. People are being tortured in those prisons, folks. They're barrel bombing it. It goes on and tells other people that are killed. Then it goes on to tell the civilians. You see in the middle there, total killed between 353,000 and 511,000 as of March 2018. I think the number is twice that amount, based on what I've been reading. Over 7.6 million internally displaced as of July 2015, and there's more since. Over 5 million refugees, 3.5 million of which are in Turkey. I don't think that this thing with Turkey is not important, because if Erdogan really wants, his big trump card is, okay, look, you're not going to give me money, you're not going to help out my economy, what am I going to do? I'm letting all the immigrants go. In fact, we're going to bus them to the borders of Europe. 3.5 million people. It'll have a big impact. Syria's pressuring the Kurds to give up territory. This report from Times of Israel just this morning, pro-Iranian militias turn on Assad, try to establish land corridor to Mediterranean. That's in the Times of Israel just this morning. So here along the Euphrates River, that's that sort of green wiggly line down there near that orange dot. There's a city there, and the Assad regime is fighting the Syrian or the Iranian militias. And part of this is because Iraq is melting down. Iraq has all kinds of problems. This goes back to, this is the famous map of the Sykes-Picot Agreement back in 1916 about how they're going to divide up the Middle East. And so the borders sort of match that today, but it was the only way that a country like Iraq was going to hold together was to have a strong man in power. And when the United States went in and took out the strong man, Saddam Hussein, everything fell apart. And that led to a cascade of problems. Syria, the Sunnis against the Shia. It's just a mess. And then, of course, the Kurds are getting hammered from both sides. They're getting hammered by Iran, they're getting hammered by Turkey, they're getting hammered by Syria. And so now they're being pressured to give up some of their territory. And the Kurdish area is a fairly oil-rich area. The other area that's oil-rich in Syria is right, Dar el-Zor is right up in this area here. And so the United States and Kurds control this side of the Euphrates. This is the Syrian forces here. And this is the oil-rich region of Syria. So that's partly what this war is about. I could do 2 hours on just this. This is an article, Washington Institute, The Great Middle Eastern War of 2019. And they look through what could happen, what's going to happen. So here's just some of what the article says. Now look, we talk about Ezekiel 38 and 39, and as I said, someday we'll get to all the different views on when that war takes place. But we know that there are going to be certain players in it. And I mentioned last week that if it's Russia, that there's a strange phrase that's in that passage a couple times in Ezekiel 38 and 39 that talks about, I will turn you back. And one commentator I looked at said, well, of course he wrote this years ago when Russia was here and Iran was here and everything. He goes, what does this turn you back mean? It doesn't make any sense. It has to be a wrong translation. But now when they're there and talking about trying to get out, Russia wants to leave. but then they'll be turned back. Now it starts to make perfect sense. And that's what I'm saying is, don't be too dogmatic in the way you think these things are going to play out exactly, because things change, the facts on the ground change. And whatever the scripture says will work out perfectly according to God's statements, but it will happen in an existing geopolitical world. So don't try to force it or try to, again, I have my own ideas about how things are going to work out, but all of my ideas are in PowerPoint, and I can erase them very quickly and change them. So there's this joke that goes around in Bible prophecy community that the 30 minutes of silence that we have in Revelation, that's so all the prophecy teachers can update their charts. And I don't think that's too far-fetched. So listen to what a little bit of this article says. The next war in Israel's north will not simply be a more instructive, and remember the title is The Great Middle Eastern War of 2019. It's 2018. And this article is well written. It comes from a credible source. The next war in Israel's north will not simply be a more destructive replay of the 2006 Lebanon war, but will likely involve many more actors on multiple fronts. Unprecedented challenges for escalation management, of war fighting and conflict termination, and the possibility of a regional conflagration. So, that's the bad news. The good news is that sort of sounds like what the Bible said 2,500 years ago when Ezekiel wrote these things and other prophets. Here's just some more from the article. Growing tension on Israel's northern border have raised concerns about yet another Israel-Hezbollah confrontation or a war between Israel and Iran and Syria. Such a war may or may not be limited to the original participants, but could involve an array of Shia militias and even the Assad regime, and could span the region, thereby affecting vital U.S. interests. Two factors are driving these tensions: efforts by Hezbollah and Syria with Iran's help to produce highly accurate missiles in Lebanon and Syria that could cripple Israel's critical infrastructure and make life there intolerable, and Iran's efforts to transform Syria into a springboard for military operations against Israel and a platform for projecting power in the Levant. Now listen, this is from a secular source. I cite secular sources a lot of times, sometimes to show that people are wrong, like on this whole transgender issue, and other times to show that secular people who pay attention to geopolitics and military strategy and military strength and that sort of thing are coming to conclusions that seem to line up with what the Bible says is going to happen in the latter days. And so when that happens, you should really pay attention, I think, to what's going on. Because we do have a framework for how things are going to work out. Let's see. The article continues. The potential for yet another war, one of unprecedented scope and complexity, is an outcome of the Syrian civil war, which has enabled Iran to build a military infrastructure in Syria and to deploy its Shia Foreign Legion to Israel's borders. By the way, in that area where the Iranian backed Shia militias are fighting with the Assad, and people are getting killed. There's been a lot of people killed in this battle for this control of this one area. The head of the Iranian Revolutionary Guard has showed up there several times. So it's an important thing, and that's why when people see that happen, they're thinking like Iran's trying to create its land bridge all the way to the Mediterranean. War is now possible on multiple fronts and in far-flung theaters fought on land, in the air, at sea, and in information and cyber domains by fighters from Hezbollah, Iran, Syria, Iraq, Afghanistan, Pakistan, and even Yemen. By the way, two of the 100 largest cities in the world, projected for 2100, are cities in Lebanon or in Yemen, projected to have like 30 million people in two different cities in Yemen by the end of this century. The world is really changing. The widened scope, the article continues, of a possible war will create new military options for Iran and Hezbollah and stretch Israeli military capabilities to their limits. Hezbollah Secretary General Hassan Nasrallah said as much, though perhaps with some exaggeration, that he warned in June 2017 that if an Israeli war is launched against Syria or Lebanon, it is not known that the fighting will remain Lebanese Israeli or Syrian Israeli, and this could open a way for thousands, even hundreds of thousands of fighters from all over the Arab and Islamic world to participate. Now, does that sound like anything that Bible prophecy teachers have been talking about for a long period of time? It certainly does. Likewise, IRGC Commander Mohammed Ali Jafari stated in November 2017 that the fate of the resistance fronts is interwoven and they all stand united, and if Israel attacks a part of it, the other component of the front will help it. Such a war is most likely to occur as a result of unintended escalation after another Iranian action against Israel from Syria, or after an Israeli strike in Lebanon or Syria, for example, against missile production facilities. And so there are all these, it could start as a result of U.S. or Israeli nuclear strike on Iran's nuclear program. It might even come about as a result of a conflict that starts in the Gulf, but that reaches Israel's borders, perhaps as a result of Iranian diversionary moves. So here are some scenarios that they have. There's a Lebanon plus war, a war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, in which Iranians or thousands of foreign Shia fighters and even Hamas, that's Gaza, as Caroline Glick refers to it as Hamasistan, also participate. The Syrian front remains relatively quiet, with Israel acting there on a limited basis to interdict the movement of fighters and capabilities into Lebanon. One is a war in Syria, a war between Israeli and Iranian forces, and perhaps even elements of the Syrian military fought on Syrian territory. Another scenario is a two-front war, a war between Israel and Hezbollah in Lebanon, and also on the Syrian border. There could be additional fronts and theaters. A war in Lebanon and or Syria might prompt the following: attacks on Israel from Gaza, unrest in the West Bank, or terrorist attacks in Israel, Houthi attacks on Israeli interest in the Red Sea, or Israeli strikes on Houthi targets in Yemen, missile attacks on Israel by Shia militias in Iraq, and Israeli counterstrikes. Some of these militias have already warned that the latter could trigger attacks on U.S. personnel in Iraq. Israel versus Iran is another scenario. Israel attacks Iran to strike a blow against the central pillar of the enemy coalition and thereby influence the course of the war. Alternatively, Iran augments attacks on Israel from Syria or Lebanon with attacks from its own territory, perhaps after suffering heavy losses in Syria. And then a regional war. Maybe it just doesn't stay limited to the Syrian and Lebanese border with Israel. Very interesting things, and it concludes with this. One of the concluding paragraphs is this: Russia is a key actor in Syria and could be a key factor in a future war. Will Moscow stand aside, or will it constrain Israel's ability to strike pro-regime forces in Syria to prevent the unraveling of the Assad's regime's post-2015 civil war gains? Go read it. Great article. Okay, President Trump had this to say. He was actually in Columbus on Friday. He had this to say earlier in West Virginia this week at a rally about the Israel peace plan.
I also recognized the capital of Israel and opened the American embassy in Jerusalem. What happened? Because every president, many presidents, they said, we're going to do it. We're going to move our embassy to Jerusalem. It's going to be the capital of Israel. And we're going to do it, we're going to do it, and then they don't do it. And if there's ever going to be peace, remember I said it, with the Palestinians, it was a good thing to have done because we took it off the table. Because every time there were peace talks, they never got past Jerusalem becoming the capital. So I said, let's take it off the table. And you know what? In the negotiation, Israel will have to pay a higher price because they want a very big thing. They'll get something very good because it's their term next. Let's see what happens. It's very interesting. I've always heard that's the toughest deal of all deals. That's called peace between Israel and the Palestinians. They say that's the toughest of all deals. Let's see what happens.
Now, a lot of people got upset. What does he mean by higher price? Israel's going to have to pay a higher price. And the Palestinians are going to get something. It wasn't defined. There are reports that the peace plan will be unveiled in large part at the UN meetings the end of September. I think the president is supposed to speak in New York on September 25th. John Bolton was in Israel this week. He said there would be no quid pro quo. I'm not going to play, I have a clip of his news conference, but we're a little bit short on time today. You can find that online. And there's also a great article by Caroline Glick, A Conversation with John Bolton, where he talks about things. And if you're on Facebook, there's a Jewish man named Avi Abelow, Abelow, and he does a Tuesday morning interview with Caroline almost every week. So they took a few weeks off for summer vacation, but they were back this week. And Caroline makes some good points. This was before she had the meeting with Bolton. But she was saying, look, you know, Israel has to make their case for the Golan Heights. That was one of the questions. Is the U.S. going to support Israeli sovereignty over the Golan? And Ambassador Bolton said, we're not changing our policy right now. Now, some people say, oh, my goodness, that's just terrible. But the point is, Israel, make your case as to why you should continue sovereignty over the Golan Heights. I don't think it's a very difficult case to make. And Caroline, in an interview this week with Avi, has some wonderful, well thought out, well stated concerns about this whole two-state solution thing. Is it going to work? Everybody's tied up with the two-state solution. The man who really kind of came up with the idea was 94, passed away this week. He was a peace activist, well respected in Israel. But is it going to work? And is this the covenant that Daniel talks about? We don't know exactly what that covenant is. It would seem that this is at least part of it. Trump has done some great things. He cut $200 million in aid to the Palestinians this week, which really upset Abbas. This is Abbas a week ago Saturday talking about, we're going to do to you guys what they're doing in Gaza. And Caroline Glick makes a good point is, if we do a two-state solution, we're going to have Gaza in Judea and Samaria. What happened? And because the people support Hamas by and large, they don't like Abbas. He's in the 13th year of a 4-year term. So that's a big problem. At the Hajj this week, they asked these Muslims. They did a survey, and this was reported by Reuters. Muslim at Hajj, this is their pilgrimage to Mecca, Medina. Muslims at Hajj blame Arab disunity for Jerusalem embassy move. Like the Arabs were all united until Donald Trump moved the embassy to there last year. The other thing that I think I like what Trump is doing, he's taking the right of return off of the table. So, great article by Dexter Van Zyl. This lady spoke in June at one of the Episcopal Church conferences. I want you to listen to what she said. I'm going to do just like 2 or 3 more points, and then I have about a 3-minute video, if you'll bear with me. Here's what she said at this conference.
Microphone 1.
Harris, Massachusetts. We do know that there are both sides to every story, and there are different sides within each story. But this story is about the power of a state over an oppressed people. And while Palestinians may throw rocks and burn tires and have graffiti, the Israeli government has used consistently weapons that are militaristic and are violent. I was there a couple of years ago on the Temple Mount a 3-year-old little boy with Palestinian with his mother was bouncing a rubber ball. The ball happened to sort of roll away from him and go over the side down to the Western Wall, otherwise known as the Wailing Wall. And immediately, the Israeli soldiers came up to the Temple Mount and attempted to put handcuffs on a 3-year-old little boy for bouncing a rubber ball.
Now, I suggest that look, it's a lie. Okay, Dexter Van Zyle's good article in the Jerusalem Post this week is Christianity about loving God or hating Jews. And he cites this example. Now, she's since apologized and said that she wasn't there. It really didn't happen. And I would suggest to you, she also won about a guy who was shot like 6 or 8 times that had been neutralized, and they still shot him 6 or 8 times. And it never happened. She got caught. Now listen, that was pretty easy to do. This is the Western Wall, and the Temple Mount is above it. And you see those trees? Okay, so the ball rolled down over the west. He was just bouncing the ball. Okay, when you go up on the Temple Mount, this is what you see. These are the trees, and you see these arches over here and these buildings and everything. That's what's right along here. So it's not like there's land there and it just kind of rolled over the edge. There are buildings and trees and restrooms and everything there. This is part of this anti-Semitic, anti-Jewish lies. And it only works one way. This is a report from the Begin Sadat Center, When Palestinian Blood Isn't Equal. And they cite that in Syria, about 8,000 Palestinians have been killed or disappeared during the Syrian civil war. One kid gets arrested and the whole world goes crazy. 8,000 Palestinians who have been denied Syrian citizenship, denied the ability to become part of Syrian society, they get killed or go missing or tortured or in prison by another Muslim Arab, and nobody says anything. There are other myths that happen. I'll do this and then my one thing. You go to the Edinger report. One of the myths is we can't have a one-state solution because, well, there'll be too many, all these Palestinians will come back. And that's why Trump is very right. He's getting rid of the right of return. He's getting rid of their refugee status. It's about time somebody did something like this. You know, it's the only place in the world that refugee status is inherited like a property right. And Edinger, Yorm Edinger and Caroline Glick in her book, Israeli Solution, talk about the fact that this is a myth that's grown up over the years. Ever since Israel, before Israel was a country, everybody said it's impossible. You can't, there are too many Arabs. You can't go back there. You can't do anything. And he says, he cites this, in fact, a very famous guy who wrote some letters, he wrote to the head, Theodor Herzl, the founder of the Zionist movement. The reconstruction of the Jewish state with a sizable Jewish population in Palestine is impossible politically, socially, and economically. In March 1898, the leading Jewish demographicer Simon Dubnow published a demographic projection aiming to dissuade Theodor Herzl from the vision of the reconstruction of the Jewish state in the land of Israel. In 1998, there will be only 500,000 Jews in the land of Israel. Political Zionism is wishful thinking. In October 1944, another founder of the Israel Central Bureau of Statistics published a demographic projection intending to convince Israel's founding father, David Ben-Gurion, that a population of then 600,000 Jews. So Dubov was wrong because he said in a century there won't be 500, there'll only be 500,000, but by 1944 there were 600,000. And he just said it's not enough. In 2001, there will be, under the best case scenario, 2.3 million Jews, a 34% minority. There are now 7 million Jewish people. I mean, this goes on and on. All these, there's a paper, No Arab Majority in the Land of Israel. That was David Ben-Gurion. Here it is, the statistics in this article. They're having many more births, 7 million Jews, along with 130,000 Druze, 130,000 Christian Arabs, and 1.6 million Muslims in Israel proper right now. In addition, there are 1.85 million Arabs in Judea and Samaria. And listen, folks, this is overstated. This is the tell an eye. Biblical eye is right here. Around here, there are neighborhoods, and Pam and I, the one thing I noticed when we went to these different biblical sites in Judea and Samaria, often called the West Bank, was that there was nobody around. I mean, like, we were there at the biblical site, but there was like nobody else there. And that's what Caroline Glick points out, is there are all these neighborhoods and nobody lives there, but they get counted like they live there. And they don't. And it's overstated, and it becomes an impediment to a one-state solution. Everybody thinks that it's going to be a two-state, and I have about 45 minutes of comments I could make about this. Listen, this anti-Semitism is tied to anti-Israel. This is the Yad Vashem. It's a phenomenal museum. It's very moving. If you've ever been here, you end at the tour of the museum before you walk up this ramp to see a beautiful overlook of Israel, is the Hall of Names. And in these shelves here, there are notebooks trying to identify the people who were murdered, slaughtered, killed in the Holocaust. I bring this up because yesterday Prime Minister Netanyahu was in Lithuania, and he gave a speech at the site of the Plenary massacre. There's a picture of what happened. The Lithuanians, not the Nazi Germans, the Lithuanians marched Jews out, lined them up along, and shot them and pushed their bodies into the pit. There's a Holocaust survivor, Shalom Sorensen. This was one of the things, you see these videos. Turn down the sound on this. You see this, he went out, he says, I stood by my grandfather. We had no strength left. You see this at the Yad Vashem. A Lithuanian ripped a rag and gave it to us to tie over our eyes. He's with his grandfather. I tied it a little higher to see what was underneath me, without anyone noticing. The Lithuanians who shot us, Lithuanians shot us, not Germans, fired regular rifles. They stood above the pit. We stood inside the pit on top of the dead. He's 16 when this happens. Someone behind us gave the order to shoot. When they gave the order to shoot, my grandfather, Shmuel Lifshin, my mother's father, started praying, "Hero Israel." I only managed to hear it once, to say it once, before the shot. I fell before the shots went off, and the dead fell on top of me. He goes on to tell the story about how he laid there. He doesn't know how long, didn't move. They came through and shot the dead again to make sure they were dead. He was under another body. And then sometime he moved a little and he felt a hand grab his leg. It was another 16-year-old boy. And they escaped. You go to the Yad Vashem website and their YouTube channel, and you can see testimony after testimony of these people who survived. This needs to be fought by the church. This is why I consider anti-Israel to be anti-Jewish, anti-Semitic. The world is on this trajectory, And so here's this man. I mean, look how old he is. Oh, this is 60 years later he's talking about it. Look how it affects him. God has a plan for Israel. And we live at a time when it appears to be unfolding. And we should act on it and at the same time consider ourselves blessed. Let's pray. Father, pray for us this week and those in Israel. You keep them safe. Show them your mercy and love. Make the church stand as a faithful witness to the power of God and the truth of the gospel to everyone, to the Jew first. And pray you'll bless us this week. Bless Pastor Steve. Pray you'll heal his foot and get him back to health quickly. Watch over us this week in Jesus' name. Amen.